the idea of particularity is pretty much the death knell to liberalism and to some extent even the American understanding. We're terrified of particularity, but it's necessary. The strong gods are coming back either way. I don't think we can avoid it. And so I think all the mature people in the room are really having conversations about how do we best interact with this fact in a way that's organic and helpful, and nourishing for the people that we care about. And all the people who are deeply invested in the current system are running around screaming, at guys like you, for pointing out that perhaps, there's more to history than this brief window in which we've tried to strip it of all of its true existential nature.
Yeah, this is maybe a left turn. I don't know how much time we got left, but I also feel that like since the 1960s, we've this is another parallel with Rome, maybe, when like they started importing the ISIS cult to like a lot of the elites and stuff like late in their history. But that we don't see it that way now. But I think honestly, historians might look back at our music, our literature, our movies, just all of our cultural output during this era, and realize that since the 1960s, we all kind of fell into a sex cult and just a cult of pleasure. And primarily sex, but just individual pleasure in general. And that became, once you allow like the masses of people to kind of fall into that, and you you remove the shame that used to prevent people from falling into it, you delegitimize all of the sources of local authority that might have, held people back from falling into it. It's very, very, very hard for an individual to not join the party. You know what I mean? And so since the 1960s, like, that fulfillment of my individual desires. Even so, you saw this even with somebody like Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was like a just sort of constitutionally, like, he was a conservative person. He was an old school dude. He was an athlete. He wrote a letter to Nixon and told him, to tell him he was supporting what he was doing in Vietnam and so forth. And he loves Spengler and Schmidt, a lot of these old guys. He's like naturally a conservative person, but then you have him like in the 60s and 70s, coining that phrase, "follow your bliss." Like that's the meaning of life right there. And it's like once you have the large, just really, almost everybody subscribing to that, and it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the people who still want to identify with this larger whole, that whole starts to disintegrate, like it slips through your fingers, whether you want it to or not. That it becomes like really hard to get people to look up, from their own loins and actually care about anything beyond where their next fix is coming from. And I think that's something, honestly, that, again, I don't know if this is necessarily a conspiracy or if it's just an outgrowth of our ideology, or if it's something that happens, like, again, not as a conscious conspiracy, but more in like the system's purpose is what it does kind of thing. It does, people have talked about this before, sexual liberation as a form of political and social control, because, people who were slaves to their passions and primarily focused on fulfilling those things, can be convinced and bought off, to surrender their political agency, as long as they're provided with those things. And we've really done that en masse. And I think, like, the difficulty that people like us have now, and this is, like, to me, the really interesting conversation, especially in America. I think in Europe, it's a little bit different. I think for the Irish, their challenge is, how do we reverse the demographic trend in our country and turn this back into Ireland? Like, that's pretty straightforward to me. America, because we've always kind of, our identity's constantly been renegotiated, like every generation, as new people come in and we have to accommodate them and need them into the national dough, that, we're like, for us, like, our confusion about our identity is maybe the most natural thing about us, and so the fact that all of those things that would have provided the bedrock for that national identity have kind of been swept off the board, I think it means that, like, a lot of people on the right, we love our Greek statues and our Nietzsche quotes and all these kind of things. They want to look back to the past as, to find something that we need to revive, return with a V, and, and all that. But and I'm sympathetic to that. But at the same time, I kind of doubt that that's really possible, and that our real challenge is much more difficult, because we have to figure out how to build something from scratch and what that should look like. It doesn't mean we can't learn from the past or take bits of our tradition from the past. But we have to admit the fact, we have to admit the really terrible, terrible state that our people are in. Our people are, you could say America's a Christian country and there's a lot of practicing Christians. I know a lot of people who go to church, and I don't know a lot of people who really believe in Christianity anymore. I don't know a lot of people who really are loyal to their families or their communities or anything like that anymore. In a way that, like, it's a basic governing principle of their life. You know what I mean? And so when you don't have like all of those basic fundamental things that, you're trying to talk about, how do we keep this country together? How do we tie like citizen to citizen? We got to go back and start figuring out how to tie neighbor to neighbor again, how to tie brother to brother again. I mean, that's where we're at, and that is, and I think honestly, like, one of the reasons we avoid that, I don't know if we necessarily avoid it, but like that it doesn't get talked about as much, is that, you can talk about whether America is going to balkanize or we can find some collective national identity to hold us together or whatever. And you can write a book about it and whatever, but that's not something that, there's no barricades to man over that. You don't have to actually get up early and go do something over that. It's really like a theoretical conversation that we're having. And if it's going to change, it'll be because like the national mood or just the mood of our people changes over time. And like, things change as a result of that. But, to knit our communities and our families and everything like that together again, it means you have to skip playing video games today because, you're going to go hang out with your neighbor who's kind of boring and like, annoying, but he's your neighbor. And his wife is friends with your wife and your kids are friends with their kids. So you're going to go hang out with them, and just doing those things that you have to actually go out and do instead of just talk about. Once we kind of admit those needs, I think that we know that it's gonna impose an obligation on us to actually leave our house.
Well, civilization is indistinguishable, but from like a collection of low time preference behaviors, right? Like we could start with someone modern like Sam Francis, but you can just go right back to Aristotle, right? That like virtue is what creates a civilization. It's the ability of one to discipline oneself, to have a shared understanding of kind of what the restrictions on behavior should be, and that they're critical for the perpetuation of your way of life. Like, this is, we look at kind of our high functioning societies now, and we think that these things are just kind of the way that humans work. But of course that's not, right? Like, there's a million civilizations in the waste bin of history where people just did what they wanted to do, right? They didn't put a sufficient value on planning for the future, denying themselves creating virtue. There are so many examples, we can't even begin to discuss them now, right? So what we're looking at, I think, is just again, I think Spengler's right. I think civilizations have a morphological life cycle. I think that entropy acts on every collective force of organization, and that ultimately the things that we build up that create great success also get torn apart over time, being kind of victims of their own success. And again, as we've kind of discussed already, not only does entropy wear on these things, but the desire to modernize and scale up is actually pretty dependent heavily on the annihilation of virtue. Even though we kind of don't recognize that, beyond a certain point, we need to strip virtue out of a population in order to expand the state's control and its reach and the ability to order that. Because again, virtue is particular, and people are not going to like me saying that, but whatever. Like, that's the, cultural Daseins are particular to peoples. Virtues are built in communities. Aristotle understood this as well as Heidegger did, that you create expectations and norms that bind people together because they live in proximity to each other, because they recognize within each other the attainment of a particular ideal. And that's what drives those in a community to kind of maintain it over time. And once you've gotten beyond the ability of the community to constantly communicate and enforce that expectation, it's gonna atrophy. It has to. And so I think in a very real sense, we can't bind our communities back together because we've literally made it illegal. It's illegal to have real communities in the United States because those are dangerous to the not the overall imperial identity project, right? You can't have people who feel specifically Virginian because one day they might lead a force of Virginians against the Union, right? Like that's a real problem that states face when you have that level of community loyalty.